So our next speaker, before our break, is Victor Lombardi. He's the author of Why We Fail, Learning from Experience Design. I am currently in the midst of reading it. So far, it's been great. Over the last few months, many months, years, you've been doing research on why products are failing. And Victor's been all over the country talking to companies that have had failed products and doing this research on what happened. What really happened? And I think it's so great that you come at it with this outside perspective to really look at all the different angles. And so he's taking the stage today to share with us kind of what are the most common reasons that he's seen big famous companies have product failures, and what can you take from those failures to make sure that your product doesn't fail. Also as a reminder, every speaker has Q&A at the end, so think about questions that you want to ask, because I don't know what you're looking to learn. So on that note, let's switch up Victor's slides. Great. Victor, you're welcome to take it away. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I'm happy to be here. Usually when I tell people outside the industry that I've done all this 3 years of research really on websites and applications and consumer electronics that have failed, they're like, oh, that's interesting, and they kind of take a step backwards and think a little strange, but I feel like I'm among my people here. So I did a ton of research. I was approached by a publisher to look into this book because he felt learning about failure was important. So I started by looking at maybe 100 different cases of failure, everything from video games to old word processors to startups, big enterprise software. And I learned what I could learn there, and then narrowed it down to about 10 products that I thought offered really interesting lessons in what happens when somebody tries to do something innovative. And they're fairly contemporary examples. They happen all within the past 10 years or so. And what happens when they actually get out the door? We know all the 10,000 things that are necessary to get the good product out the door. And they managed that. They got a good product into the market, often hailed for great design. And then some failure happened. And the failure was often in the interaction between the product and the customer. Not necessarily the technology failed or bad product management or bad marketing. So I was looking mainly at that, and then some of the underlying causes for those things. So let me tell you one story. Going back to 2007, you might remember this is what Twitter looked like. Just a shell of the Twitter that you know today. And as you're laughing a little because you can see the design was still evolving, to put it politely. And there wasn't really much you could do on Twitter back then. You could post messages, you could follow people, but there was no direct messages, there's no lists, there's no way to search for other people. So if you didn't know their Twitter name, there's no way to find other people. But it was doing pretty well. It was the only one doing this for a while, of course. They were the first to market, and they were growing steadily over time. It wasn't the hockey stick growth of later on, but growing steadily over time. Although every few days, the site would go down. You'd see the fail whale. So if you put yourself back in 2007, it's not unreasonable to think a competitor could come in and take a lot of market share here. And there were a slew of competitors. One of which was, I think was the most interesting, was Pounce. So Pounce did what Twitter did, but also had a lot of other interesting features. First of all, they had what I'd say is arguably better visual design. But you could also send direct messages. You could also send messages to just a group of people. They had threaded conversations. You could send files to people. You could send meeting invitations. And a lot of these things you see now on Twitter, which kind of validates, I think, the value of what Pounce was doing. Whether by luck or through research, they were onto something. I think what they're offering, we know now, has value. So this is a multifaceted story. There's a lot going on here, and I won't do justice to them in a short talk, but let me try to talk about the essence of what happened. The red line in this graph is the traffic to Twitter from about 2006 for the following 12 months. So you can see they were growing gradually. The blue line is Pounce, which launched around July of 2007. Amazingly, when they launched, they actually exceeded the historical numbers of Twitter. So they're off to a great start for a variety of reasons. I think this was a tide that raised all boats. The popularity of Pounce launching also gave more popularity to Twitter, and so you see Twitter's numbers jumping. But then Twitter kind of just continues its the same kind of growth curve. Pounce, however, starts falling from there. If we extend this graph out for the next 12 months, we see the story they're familiar with. Twitter kind of shoots up in its growth pattern, and Pounce kind of flatlines. And in essence, I think what happened was that Twitter, as the first mover, built up a critical mass of messages and of customers. And when it comes to social media, that was the most important thing. People wanted to post where there were readers, and people wanted to read where there were writers. Right? So as a product designer, as a founder, this was really sobering to look at these kind of stories. And this was one of the trends I kept seeing over and over, was that what we traditionally think of as great design or really valuable features or even uptime doesn't necessarily equate with the experience that's most important to people. I think in this case, that critical mass of messages and people was the most important part of the experience to Twitter's customers. One of the reasons I think this is the case, I'm sorry, I'm supposed to wait for you to click, but I'm in the habit of doing that, was because we have so much performance at our fingertips these days. Not too long ago, like 2003, you'd see phones like on the left. This is the Nokia 6600, where you really could judge the phone by its features. It had VGA resolution camera, it had Bluetooth, and it played audio and video. And those were things that were just substantially better than the phones that came before it, and really made it for a delight to use. These days, when Apple comes out with a new phone and just says, well, we're going to give you something that's a little faster and a little more resolution, they're actually pummeled in the press for this, because we're thinking, is that all you're giving us? Is just a little bit more performance, right? So the game has changed. I think it's no longer about performance when you're in a product category where you already have an excess of it. So TechCrunch has called this the death of the spec. Meaning you could look at a specification list and not really know whether that's a better product or not, because you don't know whether it gives its customers a better experience or not. So I refer to this as the birth of experience. We've talked a lot about experience in terms of user experience and experience designers, and we throw the word around a lot. And in the past, frankly, I think that was kind of aspirational, that we were really just designing products, not really facilitating great experiences. But I think as certain product categories start to be injected with more software and then more rich interactions in the user interface, they do cross this kind of experiential threshold where it really is more of an experience. Another way to look at that is when the iPhone 4 came out. Consumer Reports did some very thorough tests of the phone and found it had this defect. Right? If you remember, if you held it wrong, the signal was attenuated. And usually Consumer Reports is just content to publish its reports and inform its readers and kind of move on with life. But the iPhone 4 was a huge product, was getting a lot of press. Consumer Reports probably saw this as their big PR moment, and so started doing videos and lots of interviews, and this became a huge story, right? The iPhone 4 was flawed, and everyone was, at least in the media, was broadcasting this message: the iPhone 4 was flawed. So you think sales would tank, but sales actually went in the opposite direction. People want the iPhone 4 experience, and a little flaw, not unlike Twitter's going down every once in a while, wasn't enough to kill the product, wasn't enough to turn people off. So if there's one thing that I wanted to impress upon you today that I learned from writing this book, was that design does not equal experience. That what we normally think of as great products or great visual design doesn't necessarily translate to a great experience on the part of your customers. And even what we think of as flawed features or flawed design doesn't necessarily translate to a bad experience. So the question that Cass so rightly poses to all of us today is, what should we do differently tomorrow if you buy my premise? So one thing I've started doing a lot differently is using scientific method-based approaches a lot more. Things like customer development and lean startup. Can I get a quick show of hands of who already uses techniques like this? Yeah, and that's what I typically see is about half the people I talk to are at least familiar with it or put it into use. The reason I think these are important is because what they try to do dovetail nicely with what I found in my research, which was to regard everything that you're currently doing as just an educated guess. You know, all your thoughts about your design, everything on your whiteboard, everything in your roadmap is just a hypothesis. And until you go out and actually test that with customers, you don't really know if the customer thinks that's valuable, if they're having a good experience or not. So I think that's a great place to start. If you're already doing that, I want to make you aware that there's a whole field of people that do that for a living. One thing I do like about Lean Startup is encourages everyone, founders, employees, to go out and do your own research, especially at the early days of a product or a company, to actually test something with a customer and see them, struggle with it. You get this kind of visceral reaction of watching your customers struggle with something you design and realizing, oh yeah, I failed, I need to redesign that. It's so much more powerful than just looking at data on a piece of paper. And when they turn around and say, no, I won't pay for this, it's a very powerful emotional reaction that I think you take back to the company and learn from. But as you start to become more sophisticated, your products become more complex, you start targeting different audience segments. It's impossible to do all that yourself, right? And so these people called design researchers, and it's a skill set maybe some designers have, where they have tools, they have methodologies, just to help you understand what your customers are experiencing when they use your products or your competitors' products. So this is a tool called Primo, for example, which helps measure the emotions people feel when they're using your product. One thing I think Lean Startup doesn't tell you is what you should test. I think that's because it really can't, right? It kind of stops at that point and says, you need to use your gut. And really, you should know what is the most risky thing about your product or your company. And you should prioritize those and go out and test them in order of priority. So that's a good place to start. But having done all this research, I looked back at it and I said, well, I really should have some inkling about why these things failed and where I should start looking first. I should be able to learn from those examples. So I put these together. I kind of brought them all together in 4 buckets of failure types. I gave them a pithy little acronym to help me remember them called PACT, which stands for Perception, Audience, Competition, and Technology. So let me take you through these. When it comes to perception, to go back to the Pounce example, what's interesting to go back and look at what Pounce said about themselves during that time was that they felt they were very different than Twitter. And again, if you look at their list of features, it looks like a very different product, right? You can imagine this being just something used for work groups, something, and a product like Yammer had a lot of success doing that. So again, not unimaginable that this was a very different product. But this wasn't the way the media and customers perceived them. They thought, Pounce thought the positioning was very different. Media and customers were comparing them as if Pounce and Twitter were direct competitors. And as direct competitors, Twitter won. So that's something you can really test, is our perception of our brand, our positioning, our product the same as what customers think it is? Another thing you look at is whether you're validating your ideas with your right audience. OpenID is a pretty well-known example of kind of a tragic usability failure, but it didn't start out that way. It actually started off as a huge success story. OpenID was used as kind of a single sign-on method within the huge LiveJournal ecosystem of blogs. And within that ecosystem, people loved it. They understood how it worked. Everyone had a blog, so everyone had a URL. So the idea of using your URL to sign into something made sense. Folks looked at this and said, it works so well there, let's make it available to everyone, the general public, because we need to get rid of this mess of names and passwords without testing it with this new audience, without validating that idea that it should work. And this seems like a kind of obvious, maybe stupid mistake, but I think we're all vulnerable to this. Often we get out the door and try to get traction with early adopters. Those early adopters may be a little geekier than our eventual target audience. They may know a little bit more about the industry that we're targeting. And so you don't want to fall prey to getting all your validation from them if really eventually you want to grow with another audience. Competition is another one, and these stories really kind of broke my heart when I looked at these. Because often there were companies and products that were doing really well and had plenty of customers. Customers loved them. But at some point, they just had this fatal flaw where someone just came along and did something so much better, it beat them out of the market. So this is Wasabi, which was a personal finance website that was beaten some years later after it launched by Mint.com. And what Mint.com did much easier was to say, if you want me to aggregate all of your financial information, I'll take your name and password for you. I'll go to your bank's website, scrape that information off, and present to you with your balances and transactions in a very beautiful format. Wasabi, for some very good business reasons, said we don't want to do that. But we're going to make an assumption that people want control over their names and passwords. And they'd rather download that information from their bank and then upload it to our service. And it was a very rational decision that they went, rational decision-making process they went through, but they never validated that. So that was a big assumption about what their customers wanted that left them, I think, vulnerable to the competition. The fourth area is technology. So every once in a while, there's a big wave of new kinds of user interface technology that is so significant and changes the way we interact with things. And with each one of those waves kind of crashes on the beach. Some companies just fail to take it up and run with it and fail because they didn't want to cannibalize their own business. So in the case of touchscreens, I think there are people like Nokia who didn't want to start from scratch, didn't want to give this huge installed base of Symbian, and just kept building more touchscreen features on top of it, creating really a kind of a usability and a mess compared to what Google and Apple and others created, which was starting from scratch and realizing this is a whole new technology. It may even cannibalize what we were doing before, which was brave decision on Microsoft's part to ditch their old operating systems and embrace Windows Phone. And this happens every few years, and there's always companies that fail as a result. You can look back to the change from DOS to Windows, for example, and companies like WordPerfect, who had a huge market share advantage there on almost the entire market. And they lost just about the whole market because they were so slow in moving that software over to Windows. So that's the one point I want to emphasize to you today is, if you don't take anything else away from the talk, is that what we regard as design, what we look at as our products, if we haven't validated that with our customers, that they think customers are getting a good experience from that design, then I'd say we don't really know if it's a good design or not. Thanks.
Any questions on product design, what you expect from your product, how to talk to your customers, your users?
Hi, when you have a product that's ahead of the market's awareness, but it'll take a little while to get it out there anyways, it's very hard to go out and ask customers, how would you feel about this thing that you've never seen before? Do you have any suggestions on that, of how to deal with being ahead of the curve, which is what startups fundamentally need to do?
Are you thinking of something that's kind of still in the research phase, or do you think
Well, like,
it's...
for example, I was one of the founders of a company called Worlds Inc., which did the first 3D virtual worlds on the internet.
Okay.
Nobody had seen anything like this before, and you'd walk in and they'd go, what is it? I mean, it's just very hard to introduce an entirely new concept, an entirely new way of thinking.
Yeah, it's a complicated answer. I would probably look into different launch techniques then, because maybe it's not a matter of just rolling it out and testing during the design process, or just testing during the launch process. As an example, I'm really interested in the way Google Glass is being rolled out. So I think Google learned its lesson with things like Google Wave of how not to roll things out, and so Google Glass is something comparable, where some people don't know what this thing is or how it works or what we're going to do with it. But they're starting very gradually to say, let's just give this to some early adopters in this case. Let's see what they do with it. Let's not try to commercialize it too soon. And of course, Google has the luxury of doing this because they have other revenue streams. I don't know if it was the case with your company, but I see that as a pretty good way to go forward, where just the viability of it in the market is a huge question mark.
Yeah, thanks a lot for your presentation. Although I couldn't help but think sort of midway through, it's just a wonderful series of hindsights that you gave us. And by the way, like, having been involved and knowing a number of the people who were involved in some of those specific decisions, there's way more luck that also gets malattributed to some of these things as well, around timing, around people involved, around funding events, I mean, all sorts of things like that too. So what I was hoping is, rather than take some of the hindsight lessons and try to sort of vector in on some conclusions, what can we as designers today, or maybe even non-designers, take to look at proactively how to help make sure that our next designs succeed as opposed to fail?
Yeah, those are all good points. My hindsight is very clear. I think, and I didn't have time to go into this kind of detail today, but if you can't see my slides, but if you look at an example like Pounce, and I'm not saying they should have done this with my 2020 hindsight, I'm just saying, looking forward, you could say, if we're in the same situation and we want to validate if our perception of the positioning is the same as the customer's perception of it, then you can turn that into a hypothesis. Go through the lean startup method and say, we think that at least 30% of the people who are using Twitter would instead use Pounce, or at least use Pounce in addition to Twitter, and that 30% would come from a number of places. It could be a financial calculation of how much market share you need to grab in order to be viable, right? And then you can run an experiment to say, let's seed groups of people, because maybe the groups are where they have their advantage and where they're positioned really differently, for maybe a month, and make sure they're using it, and then go back at the end and say, are they still using Pounce? Are 30% using Pounce at least instead of Twitter, or in addition to Twitter? And if you don't hit that mark, then you failed that test, right? So that's where I'm getting at with these 4 categories, is that they can lead directly to how you form your hypotheses and how you run your tests about what to do. Does that answer your question? Does that help?
Thank you.
Good.
We can talk about it afterwards.
Okay,
Sure.
great.
One more question?
There we go.
So I love designers, because you guys see things and you think differently than all the rest of us do. So for all the rest of us, what are the 3 things from looking at failures, both current and historical, that you would say as entrepreneurs, looking at those failures, what should we take away? How can we make better designed products and companies, what would those be that you would want us to have today?
So I'd love to see more of the research happen early in the process. Again, that's why I'm a lean startup fanboy, is because if you think of agile development as doing more iterative testing, and user-centered design is more iterative testing, lean startup pushes that even earlier in the process. Design researchers could do it even earlier in the process to say, let's just start looking at your customers to see what they're doing. We don't even have a product in mind. Let's just find if they have any unmet needs, or let's examine their activities to get ideas for products. And so I think that's something we learn from them, that the research to do the validation as early as possible is important. Once you've got a concept, again, I wouldn't go too far, and I think that the development has gotten so cheap these days. Your tools are free. If you code yourself, you can start mocking things up. There's a tendency to go pretty far into it before you test something. But again, I think you can come up with a mock-up pretty quickly and test the concept pretty early on. I'm going to just leave it at those two, because I think if you only think of two, those are the most important.